today. The summit is a 2-day free online event for architecture, engineering, construction, manufacturing, and sustainability professionals across the construction value chain. And we're delighted to have you here to get inspired, get engaged, and get sustainable. So let's get on with the show. Embodied Carbon as Critical Investment Criterion, featuring Robbie Epsom, the EMEA Head of Sustainability and Senior Director at CBRE Investment Management, as well as Panu Pasanen, CEO and founder of OneClick LCA. The session that you're watching right now is for investors, portfolio managers, architects, engineers, contractors, consultants, specifiers, buyers, and any other construction industry professionals who want to learn about the impact of embodied carbon on economic growth. As a quick note, that today's session and Summer Sustainability Summit is brought to you by OneClick LCA, the global LCA software empowering the industry to decarbonize and get sustainable. For over 20 years, OneClick LCA has been making the construction value chain sustainable, and you can learn more at oneclicklca.com. I'd love to introduce you now to Robbie Epsom. He is the EMEA Head of Sustainability for CBRE Investment Management. In this role, he's responsible for the EMEA implementation of the firm's sustainability vision, which continues the firm's commitment to be a leader in ESG. Working closely with the sustainability team and the wider CBRE investment management business, his priority is the continued integration and harmonization of sustainability practices throughout the firm. Robbie also leads the corporate sustainability reporting workstream. Robbie, we're very excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here today. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Next up, I would love to introduce you to Panu Pasanen. He is the CEO and founder of OneClick LCA, the world's leading software platform for life cycle assessment and environmental product declarations in construction and manufacturing. He's a dedicated advocate for decarbonizing the built environment. He specializes in life cycle assessment, embodied carbon, and life cycle costing for global green building systems. And he collaborates with government bodies and large corporations to draft impactful regulation and policy. Panu, very happy to have you here today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Very excited for the show. So let's go ahead and dive in. First off, Robbie, I would love to ask you to tell us all a bit more about CBRE Investment Management and what you're getting up to there.
Yeah, hi everyone. And so Robbie Epsom, CBRE Investment Management. I'm, maybe as a bit of context as well, I am the EMEA Head of Sustainability, but I also come from a background in life cycle assessment and greenhouse gas management. So this is a very important subject to me, something that I care a lot about and have been involved with very much since the beginning of my career, where I started advising companies, infrastructure projects on exactly this type of discussion. So the reason I jumped in-house at CBREM is because we have a virtual city of 150 billion assets under management, AUM, of real estate and infrastructure. So it's a real chance to drive decarbonisation at scale and be able to set those parameters and then work with the teams to implement it. So embodied carbon, whole life carbon is a big part of our net zero journey. It's the fourth of what we call our 4 E's, which is energy efficiency, electrification, energy procurement, both on-site renewables and off-site, and then that really important piece, embodied carbon, that value chain piece. And so whilst we're not where we need to be yet, like many in the industry, we are starting our journey on whole life carbon, and today is going to be a great chance to dive into that in a bit more detail and understand a bit more about where we are in our thinking.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Robbie. And now, Panu, I'll turn it over to you to give us a bit of background on OneClick LCA and also what you're getting up to at OneClick LCA as CEO and founder.
Yeah, sure. So OneClick LCA is a software company. We power the makers of a zero carbon future. What we're trying to do is really enable regular architects, regular structural engineers, designers, planners, everyone in the construction value chain to be able to deal with embodied carbon, account for it, find ways to reduce it, and execute that. That's it. That's the starting point, though, because we don't have the same 4 E's as Robbie because we are not so much on the energy side, but there's other facets of sustainability that we're trying to help people move forward with as well. So once they get to grips with carbon, there's going to be things like biodiversity, circularity, climate resiliency, and many others. And we are at the same time trying to help people who are able to advance the sustainability agenda, at least on one front, to be able to advance multiple fronts to achieve better holistic outcomes and not just to optimize on a single parameter, even though I agree that this is the most critical parameter for climate mitigation in this part of the value chain.
Great. Thank you, Panu. All right, so I will now provide the first question of our discussion, and I'm really keen to get started. So I would first like the two of you to give a bit of context and also background on sustainability's impact on the economy. Robbie, maybe I'll pass that to you first, and you guys can engage in free discussion around this prompt.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting question because it really is intertwined into the whole economy. I like to say that we're going through a sustainable sort of industrial revolution at the moment where we're reinventing everything that was invented in the past, business models, technology, whilst reinventing or inventing new technologies that we've barely even imagined now. And apart from AI, there's not many things like sustainability that really cut across all corners of the economy. So I think it's a huge part of it. It really is driving decision making at scale. And we've got away for many hundreds of years with a sort of take, make, dispose economy, building on Panu's points on the circular economy and embodied carbon, whole life carbon, decarbonisation, but all the wider topics around climate resilience, biodiversity, social value, they are all now becoming part of our decision making, because one of the key things with regards to why this is so important is that we know we have to change, but by not understanding it properly, we can sometimes change in a way that creates problems elsewhere. We might shift a particular impact from one life cycle stage to another. We might fix an environmental issue, but create a social issue. And so understanding this in the round across the whole economy, not just in isolation at a single building or at a single company, is just so important. And it's great from a personal perspective, having been in sustainability now for coming up to 20 years, to see finally this being taken seriously across the economy. And so we're into how mode as opposed to why mode now, which is great.
Yeah, so if I continue on that, so I would think about it maybe in two ways. So, or let's say the economy is composed of services, commodities, and then advanced physical things, right? So services economy is a bit different. It's much more human labor and less material based. But if we look at then the commodities and the value chain built on top of those things, in those you have huge impacts, and especially in those parts, but similarly also in services, there's going to be three things that are going to hit economy at macro or micro scale. So the first is nobody potentially wants to buy from you if you don't have sustainability managed credibly. Second is nobody wants to fund you or at terms that you would like to get funding at, which basically means you're out of business, at least in terms of expansion. And the third is nobody wants to work for you in the younger generation, so at least. So it's kind of these kind of big forces which are steering the economy, but it's affecting more the higher value parts because commodity market is so much more fluid that the price dynamics still allow commodities to go to the market for a time when they are not procured into the more sustainability concerned supply chains. Construction and manufacturing are very sustainability focused value chain, and energy, as we heard from Robbie, energy procurement is a big thing. So energy supply chains also are in a big transformation. So this is all moving, but is it moving fast enough? No. Can we accelerate? Yes. But quite a bit still needs to happen, because ideally, like the funding in particular should be very strictly steered towards impact and not just pure labeling, from my point of view.
Yeah, I think the economy is shifting towards thinking of this as more of an opportunity now rather than the problem. And I think your point on impact and starting to shift towards building, to be able to sell something in the economy, to be able to invest in something, it has to have the ability to be measured and to be monitored. And I think there's been a lot of work that's gone on in the last couple of years to create investable KPIs for sustainability. And so I think that's really starting to drive that impact on the economy now. And when you've got credibility in those KPIs, you can really start to shift towards away from labeling and more towards how do you define impact? Because if you can't define something, it's very difficult to invest in it. But I think we're making progress now where the economy is starting to be able to transact with sustainability in mind in a way that is investable and can be transacted across different parts of the economy.
And that's an interesting thing because this part of the economy where we are predominantly working in is very fixed price oriented economy. So in advertisement and others, there's much more pay for performance type of culture. But in construction as such, you rarely pay more for doing better. You pay a fixed price for everything. But I think there's going to be some opportunities to deliver also value by trying to shift business models towards more performance-based, which obviously gets better results because the incentives are in the right way. So that's maybe something to add.
Thank you both. The next question I have for you two is about embodied carbon, which is the title of this session. And I would like you to respond to the question, why is embodied carbon so important in this area now? And maybe you could also define embodied carbon for anyone in the audience who might need a bit of a primer first.
Happy to kick off. So embodied carbon, whole life carbon, also as another terminology that's used regularly. It's really important, and in a sort of simple way of looking at it, it's the harder to reduce part of our net zero or greenhouse gas mitigation journey. It's the piece that is beyond our control, sits in our value chain. For a building, that might be greenhouse gas emissions, carbon embodied in construction materials or in the services, the plant activity at the construction site. But equally, it could be embodied carbon in the services that are provided to an operational asset in the supply chain, in the value chain. So they're the bits that sit in scope 3 of the greenhouse gas protocol. They are the bits that are harder to abate. So the reality is, for many of us in the built environment, these are the emissions that will end up in what's called our residual emissions. And those are the bits which, when we talk about net and net zero, to get that net and net zero, you've got to remove carbon, greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere to address those residual emissions. But to do that in a credible way, you're only allowed to have residual emissions for those bits that are too hard to abate or reduce. For real estate, that's likely to be somewhere between 5 and 10%. So of our total business, 5 to 10% of those greenhouse gas emissions could be considered too hard to abate. And it's very likely the vast majority of that will be made up of whole life carbon. So the reason this is so important is that embodied carbon, that whole life carbon data, is ultimately going to be the bit which probably gets some type of penalty or tax associated with it. It's going to be the bit where we have to pay to invest in carbon removal. It might be the bit that's targeted by governments for carbon taxation. It's going to be the bit that costs money if it's not managed well. But equally, it could be the piece that creates a longer payback period in terms of carbon. And a really good example of that is solar or renovation versus demolition. If we're going to put rooftop solar into an asset and the structural integrity of the roof is not good enough to take that additional load and we have to do substantial works, the amount of embodied carbon in those additional materials might negate the benefit of installing the solar in the first place. So it becomes part of a wider economic consideration than just the financials. And again, it shouldn't stop there. We've also got to look at wider life cycle assessment impact categories as well. But this is becoming way more important, but it is harder. It's hard to reduce because it requires influence and collaboration with your value chain, but also it's harder to measure because it's often data that you don't have directly. So you have to collaborate with third parties to get access to that data. But we've come a long way, as I'm sure Panu can talk to, in the last 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and another way to put it is like, it's really the dirty jobs that you get other people to do for you. That's what it is about. So, I mean, Robbie is in an office or maybe calling in from home today, but there's somebody pouring concrete on his job site, and there's another guy installing steel. And all that is getting done in the supply chain, somebody else, and it's really materials and energy intensive, but just a couple of steps away from the desk. And that's why what makes it hard, and you have to control it through design principles, design approvals, reviews, incentives, procurement requirements, and the fact that you have to do indirect, controls. That requires a bit of more, let's say, willpower to exercise on it, because it's not something you will see every day. I mean, you can't observe it. But the good news is that it all can be embedded into the standards, into the existing contract frameworks, into the existing design principles. Like, it all can be worked out, but there's like this couple of things that you need to get in nick. So every time when a tender goes out from your shop, it says, this is, by the way, the number to beat. Very simple. And then you impose a penalty if they don't meet it. So that's how the economy works for the rest of it. And embodied carbon just needs to embed it to these structures and instruments that you use to steer and contract with supply chain.
Yeah, I think another way I've quite liked it to be described is like almost like an environmental debt. If you're going to purchase a ton of concrete, ton of steel, whatever it might be, and you haven't contracted or procured from a supplier or from a country that has a low carbon electricity grid in terms of the manufacture, or has methods in the in the manufacturing process, such as cement. Maybe it's a case of electrifying the kiln, putting in carbon capture storage for the fugitive emissions, that sort of thing. If you don't think about those things, you are purchasing a product with a higher carbon debt or a higher environmental debt. And it'll be the same for other categories, social impact. We see this with rare earths and things like that, critical materials. And I think we're moving into a future where the market will start to transact with these environmental debts in mind. And it will be, you can't just build or construct a building with cheaper, energy intensive, high carbon, poor environmental, social credential type products, because if you then want to sell that asset, that data will exist, which means you're then transacting with a debt. I mean, this is blue sky thinking once the data starts to evolve and we're all measuring things in a very consistent way. But that's another way to think about embodied carbon, is it's a debt.
But that's actually a very interesting point of view, because it doesn't matter if it's true today, but what matters is that when you are selling your building 7 years from today, what if it is true? What would you do differently today? Because obviously risk mitigation is a fundamental investment criteria, and that could happen for you and the stuff that you're trying to flip in a couple of years. So if you don't get your stuff in order now, you're going to be selling stuff at discount. And if you want to sell this stuff at discount, I mean, fine, but I wouldn't go for that.
Yeah, it's the whole thinking of natural capital and starting to really think about more than just financial accounting and shifting into non-financial accounting. And I think the point of thinking to the future, if I want to sell something, not just a building, any type of high value product, what is the impact of the decisions we're making today? And could that affect value? Could it affect taxation in the future? You've got to think holistically about it. And embodied carbon is absolutely one of the first key things that we've got to think about, because you can't just think about the financial business case. You've got to think about the greenhouse gas business case. And I have no doubt that things like water footprinting and other impact categories will follow in the future.
So next up, I guess first I'd like to comment that, Robbie, you mentioned in the start of the show that you started your career 20 years ago, and you've been thinking about sustainability and environmental impact factors for 20 years. And Panu, you founded One Click LCA 21 years ago, I think, is it now? So the two of you have, a certain horizon line that you've been able to regard throughout your careers. And I'm quite curious, kind of based on this horizon, and this perspective, how far has embodied carbon as an investment criterion come since the two of you have started out in your professional lives?
Well, if I start maybe, you can get fired for it, which is a good thing. I mean, you actually have to take it seriously. So you just cannot make up stuff on this. So it means that it goes to the statutory auditors who will check your, corporate disclosures, and they will report to the company board. I mean, if you do material misstatements, not to name any companies affiliated with real estate management, but there have been material errors that have been disclosed subsequently in the press in the last 5 years. So, I mean, it's not going to be okay to put random stuff in it anymore. You actually have to have a basis for it. You have to be able to prove this. I wouldn't say it's from my perspective, it's the actual number is not necessarily yet a going investment criteria at scale, but there are certain companies which wouldn't fund new projects and increasing number. But that's how I would look at it. But I think the important here is that it's actually becoming a business critical criterion, and that is a precondition for making it investment criterion. Robbie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, and I'm almost at 20 years, not there yet, but it's been something that even came into my degree when I was studying chemical process engineering and environmental sort of thinking around that, and it's moved a long way in a positive way, in my view. I remember the start of my career working with the Bath Inventory of Carbon and Energy, which is one of the very early databases of embodied carbon, largely Excel based. And to Panu's points, everyone was doing it differently. So you were having data wasn't really that trustworthy or reliable. It was more the concept of starting to think through. So it's moved a long way. I think probably the biggest things to pull out is there's been this journey from the principles through to the evolution of standards. So we've got EN 15804 and EN 15978 for embodied carbon in kind of construction materials, but also that kind of life cycle thinking for projects as well. So there's standardization out there to make sure we're defining life cycle stages consistently. We're taking the same approach. That's a fantastic step because it means you start to get comparable data and people following the same process. Some great data sets out there, many that one-click use, and EPD programs and environmental product declarations and businesses contributing to that data. So the data, the tools like one-click LCA are all coming together. So we're getting consistency. When you start to get a consistency and to the point on those checks, something which can be audited because there is a standard behind it, there's a process, you start to get towards something which is investable. You can start to communicate it to investors. You can start to communicate it to others in your value chain. It becomes something which carries value because it means something. And I think where we are now is the really exciting point, which is where Panu and I've discussed this recently as well as we have with others, because this is really now the sort of fire that's been lit under embodied carbon. And you've got EU taxonomy, which sets a load of KPIs for economic activities to show that they are sustainable, environmental, social. For the development of new buildings under the EU taxonomy, there's that criteria for the NZEB, nearly zero emission building, nearly zero energy building, and 10% below in terms of that primary energy demand. But one of the sort of subsets of that is you need to have a whole life carbon assessment if your asset is over 5,000 square meters. So suddenly you've got a bit of regulation coming in. But the really exciting one for me is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. That to me is becoming a leveler on things like construction materials. And the premise of that is you need to understand the embodied carbon of those construction materials in order to calculate effectively a carbon tax on any materials coming from outside of the EU. So this has just changed gear completely, because now we have to understand this in the way that we engage with our developers, with our value chain, and in the way we communicate to our investors. So really exciting time, and it's come a long way in my view.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. The next question I have for you is, what is your organization's holistic approach to sustainability, and what are you looking to achieve? Maybe Robbie, you can kick that off.
Yeah, I think so as I mentioned earlier, we've got what we call the 4 E's in terms of our sort of net zero strategy. It creates those guide rails for the whole business. So we set that at the kind of firm level, and we provide those guide rails which filter down to our portfolios and the underlying assets within those portfolios. Ultimately, at the global firm level, we have our sustainability vision that sets the kind of pillars for sustainability, supported by our policy. Our 3 focus areas as a firm are climate, people, and influence. and climate is one of our absolute focus areas out of our materiality assessment, because we have a virtual city, and therefore, greenhouse gas emissions accounting for 40% of kind of global emissions when it comes from buildings, construction, operation, is a very important part of our focus. It's a big risk, but it's a big opportunity. So net zero very much is a focus for us, as is climate resilience, physical resilience of the assets. And that comes down to that typical hierarchy, which I mentioned, of energy efficiency, electrification, energy procurement, and embodied carbon. The three things we can do at the asset level is transition them to zero emission buildings. And that is the focus of the thing which we can control. Those are the first of those three E's. We can switch off the fossil fuels, electrify those assets, we can make them highly efficient, and we can procure that highly efficient electric energy from renewables on site or off site. And that's the transition which we're trying to take all of our assets on. We won't get them all there, but in our hold cycle, we want to keep them on that journey or ahead of that journey if possible. And then you get to that fourth E, embodied carbon. And that's the piece where we are trying to engage with the value chain and look at making sure we understand that, because the first thing we have to do is make sure we're measuring it consistently, because it's going to form part of our residual emissions. It's going to form part of our discussions around things like CBAM. And that is the stage we're at the moment. We're doing whole life carbon assessments. We're starting to understand that, but that's organic. We now need to set very consistent guide rails to make sure that's done consistently. It seems simple on the surface, but when you lift the hood, you have to start to define things like what is a reasonable baseline material for concrete, so you can then look at what the improvement would be as you start to spend more in terms of low carbon materials. And we've interacted with this on infrastructure projects in the past, but for real estate, we have to set a guideline for that, and that's part of the complexity. Is how do we create a common framework across our virtual city for assessing whole life carbon before, for our standing assets, after innovation, after kind of refurbishments. And how do we then collect that data centrally, and then eventually address that for reduction, but also for removal through that net zero piece in the future.
So if I continue, then we are an enabler software company, and we educate and that kind of thing. But we are really going about this in three directions. First of them is we move backward and forward in time. We try to get to earlier and earlier phases of project before a contract has been signed with anyone, for somebody like Robbie to think about what targets they should be setting. Be able to think about what's feasible, what's possible. If I own this piece of land, use, for example, generative AI to discover the most carbon efficient shape that you could build on the plot, then move forward through design, detailed design, procurement to as-built, to be able to verify that you actually get what you're paying for. So that's moving backward and forward in terms of, obviously, logically, projects only move forward, but we need to be sure we get to the early phases as well. The second is going deeper, and that's deeper in the value chain. So there's a general contractor who accounts for these things, great. That there are subcontractors they work with who have each carbon budget, great. And then the most challenging bit, making sure that every material supplier will play the game. So there we have a bit of a quantities problem, because there's about 40 million stock keeping units in the European construction material markets by Eco Platform estimate. And this year we will probably have something like 40,000 third-party verified EPDs. So a bit of a gap. Technology obviously helps. And the third is going broader. So not just carbon, but also climate resiliency, biodiversity, and other things. And we want to just push these all as hard as we can. Focus on the first two more than on the third one, because some of those other topics are more new and they are more in the education phase. But carbon is something we really want to impregnate the supply chains with, and make sure that everybody is aware of what they should be doing and what's the good number.
Great, thank you. The next question I have, and maybe I'll pass this to you first, Panu, is this can be kind of based on your own, market insights very broadly. And then Robbie, this is maybe specific to you and CBRE, but what embodied carbon goals are investors including in their criteria? Panu, I'll pass this to you first.
I think the most common and the most basic is accounting, that you actually disclose it, so you know what is in there. Like, so you're not like dealing with unknown quantity, you're dealing with known quantity. The second is that you're asking for options, that you're requiring every project to come up with options before it moves forward for after certain gates. And then at the more advanced end, there's specific requirements, so threshold levels, material specific gaps, like for example, if I'm buying steel, it cannot be more than this. If I'm buying concrete, insulation, whatever, like maximum values. And I think that's the common stuff really, like accounting, optioneering, and limiting being unfortunately least common today.
Yeah, I think probably I'd resonate the first point there on the ask from investors is to show that we are starting to understand this, which is the measurement piece. So are we carrying out whole life carbon assessments, embodied carbon? Are we doing that before and after interventions? And are we doing that in a consistent way that we can start to make decisions and report that in a meaningful way? So right now, the engagement tends to be on, are we doing that? And that's kind of where greenhouse gas accounting for scope 1 and 2, things like on-site fossil fuels through gas boilers, diesel gens, and electricity for scope 2 would have been 10 plus 15 years ago. So it's getting that consistent framework in place, but we are also starting to see, like I said, regulation that's pushing us to do this now. So if we are developing a new building and it's over 5,000 square meters, if you're in a fund that needs to report to EU taxonomy, you've got, or you want to just claim EU taxonomy alignment, you need to be able to do that whole life carbon assessment at each life cycle stage. So that's a big thing. And what we tend to see happen is when you get that set by the regulator, by the financial regulator, the investors will start to adopt those KPIs as best practice. And so the next question will likely be not just, are you doing a whole life carbon assessment, but we want to see a whole life carbon assessment that aligns with the requirements of the EU taxonomy. And then you've got CBAM. And like I said, that's, if we don't know what the embodied carbon looks like for a new development, it's very difficult for us to have a meaningful conversation with our developer and our value chain on, are we procuring the best materials? What is that cost increase from any that are coming from outside of the EU? And what's the benefit of maybe looking for materials inside the EU? And so understanding that data has a benefit for both sides. And that's probably the other bit where we're seeing the most. And I'm sure, this is on everyone's radar, the Energy Performance Building Directive, as our RICS as well, in terms of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, are all starting to produce guidance now, and also indications that regulation is going to come more widely on embodied carbon. And so I think the signal is there to business to get ready, get accounting, make sure you're doing it properly, but also start to understand how you can influence and drive performance to reduce embodied carbon. And I think the only thing I'd add to that is, like with net zero and all the other topics being built on top of that foundation, biodiversity, social value, etc., I think we're going to see the same with embodied carbon. I think embodied carbon is trailblazing for value chain impact accounting. And I think we'll start to see other topics slotted into that same way of thinking of life cycle assessment.
Yeah, I agree. Though, just to make sure nobody gets it wrong, so Energy Performance for Buildings Directive mandates that every European country updates their regulations to include embodied carbon limits within 2 years and 7 days. And that's that.
Yeah.
Piggybacking on this subject, and it might be quite early days, and you can just give an outlook here if there's not enough data, but how impactful is embodied carbon on investment opportunities? And Robbie, I think I would pass this to you first and kind of give that insider perspective, and then we can go to Panu.
Yeah, I mean, building on what I've just said, I think it will, and it is already becoming a key decision criteria on developments. The framework is there. We're playing catch up almost as an industry to make sure we have the ability to calculate that in a way which is consistent, so we can have those discussions. But the need for the discussions is clear now. As Panu said, EPBD, clear signal on that, with a countdown that started. with developers through CBAM. UK is going to hopefully bring in its own version of CBAM as well, which means you've got EU and UK. And so that has started that decision-making sort of basis. I think probably two of the most important use cases for us within our own kind of standing assets is going to be around things like rooftop solar, but also renovation versus demolition. Those are probably two of the biggest use cases that we're going to see coming up in a way that is high profile. Solar, if we are seen to put out loads of rooftop solar where we've created a massive embodied carbon payback period because of the amount of works we've done, and we've not thought about that impact, that is a risk. And so I think that's going to be one of the major first use cases, is making sure any rooftop solar project runs a embodied carbon analysis. But also on the case of when you're reviewing, should we demolish versus renovate, again, embodied carbon is going to play a very key part in that. We've already seen in London some very high profile cases with planning hitting the headlines around renovation versus demolition, and embodied carbon is front and center in that decision process. And so I think our preference is going to be leaning towards trying to renovate. We've got some great examples at the asset level where we have been reusing structure, reusing materials, circular economy type principles. But it's going to be very interesting to see how embodied carbon features in probably what will become a more regulatory thing. And I remember giving evidence probably 10 years back now to the London Environment Committee, and one of the questions was on should we regulate against demolition, and embodied carbon was front and center in that. So I think that sort of thinking is going to evolve quickly, because it is a big impact if you get it wrong, and embodied carbon is the way to understand it.
Yeah, and if I may, actually, I would like to continue with the question. So have you rejected plausible investment cases due to carbon constraints or considerations, and more specifically for embodied carbon?
So the greenhouse gas emissions carbon gets accounted for operational, so scope 1, 2, but 3 for tenant spaces. So those get considered in our investment committees. So I have a executive voting seat in our investment committees, and we analyze that data, and it comes as part of the kind of decision tool as part of investment committees. We don't have enough data systematically yet to assess embodied carbon considerations in the same way. But definitely as we start to roll this out and we have a more complete and consistent data set, it'll definitely become part of those considerations, because that if you're looking at a CapEx project, one of the key things I would like to know is we're spending this, great, we're getting it to this energy intensity in terms of operation, great, we're getting the greenhouse gas intensity down here, and we're switching off fossil fuels, but have we thought about embodied carbon payback? But we've got to have that complete data set, which requires a consistent methodology across the whole firm. And that's the project we're working on at the moment, is guidance for the firm on how we do it, what's the point that we take that before, and what's the point that we take the after, what tools should we use, what data set should we use, what baseline emission factors should we set, what concrete mix is considered standard, and does that vary for different types of asset class? Because otherwise you can introduce creative accounting where people pick a slightly worse material so they can get a bigger reduction. And I think we've seen this, both of us, Panu, on things like infrastructure projects like HS2. It's so important to set that baseline of kind of embodied carbon emission factors for those materials, that you can then look at and measure those interventions that are taken in terms of low carbon materials. So we need to do the same as a firm, and that's the stage of the journey we're on at the moment.
So if I then from our point of view, how impactful it's on the investment opportunity. So I would say it's more about limiting your options. So I think the main risk an investor will have is that you can develop a project, but you may not get the permission or the support or the tenant you want. So you have this kind of risk drivers more, and then down the line liquidity and resale value. So I think those are the real drivers of the impact today. So you can get a premium in some markets. Not every market is as competitive, but in some markets, definitely very low carbon building with well-managed embodied carbon, you can also get a premium, and you can get a flagship tenant. It's pretty hard to get Google or Nike or somebody like that to rent a building or a couple of floors from you. So they want to get many things done right, and obviously if you don't get any good tenants, then you're going to be scattered with what's left of the market, and usually it doesn't work out that well economically.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk for investment managers around embodied carbon is probably CBAM at the moment, because there's a clear cost increase for developments and refurbishments if embodied carbon is not considered as part of the planning. But I think equally there's reputational risk if it's not communicated transparently to investors. And that is the stage we're at. And we're definitely seeing questions from investors on whole life carbon, which is great, because when you get a question from your client, it gives you the ability to start to really accelerate progress there. So I always think it's really positive when we're starting to see that questioning that coming through from investors, because it means they're thinking about it. It gives us a very clear mandate to think about it beyond just regulation. So positive place, and I think we're going to see this evolve very quickly over the next couple of years, which I'm passionate to see, having been the thing which started me off in my career.
All right, we have about 10 minutes left in our session, and I'm very excited to present the top 3 takeaways from the conversation, which we aligned on before the show got started. And Robbie, as our guest today, I'd love for you to share the top 3 takeaways in your own voice, and feel free to add a bit of context if you'd like, and present these to the audience.
Yeah. So I think one of the key ones here was sustainability's impact on the economy cannot be overestimated. It is intertwined into everything, and embodied carbon is a great measure of that, because it is that value chain thinking. It's looking not just at your own operations, it's looking at how are you interacting on this key environmental impact with your value chain. So this is, like artificial intelligence, probably one of the only megatrends that really intertwines every corner of our economy. Number 2, embodied carbon is a powerful influencer for investors. It's evolving at pace, and it is going to be something which I think, as I just said, over the next couple of years, we're going to really see investors asking more questions of this, empowered by things like the Energy Performance Directive, sort of clear instruction to build this into regulation, guidance from things like RICS, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, for valuers on things like whole life carbon. And so the guidance is emerging, and as soon as you have guidance and tools, investment can follow and investors can ask questions on it. And then lastly, number 3, a sustainability agenda isn't a nice to have, it's a necessity. I think sustainability has moved on so much in my career, and I'm sure all of us on the call are seeing the same thing. It is so much more than just reporting now. It is so much more than just environmental nice to haves or CSR. This is kind of the non-financial pieces. It's the piece of the economy that everyone forgot to measure. We were always thinking about finance. We forgot about everything else: natural capital, embodied carbon, whole life carbon, social value, all the real world components that aren't, so much a fiction in some extent, like finance can be. This is the real stuff that flows through assets, through buildings, that can be measured, that has a direct real world consequence. And sustainability is all about that. It's the non-financial considerations, the natural capital, and whole life carbon is an absolute trailblazer in moving that agenda forwards.
And Panu, do you have any final thoughts to wrap that up, or?
No, I mean, this very good synthesis. It's all the real world stuff, right? That's what it's about, where people actually live and where people work and go to places. So that's it.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Before we go on, I would love to give you the opportunity to learn a bit more about CBRE Investment Management and also One-Click LCA. So CBRE Investment Management is a leading global real assets investment management firm with 144 billion in assets under management as of March 2024, operating in more than 30 offices in 20 countries around the world. Through its investor-operator culture, the firm seeks to deliver sustainable investment solutions across real assets categories geographies, risk profiles, and execution formats so that its clients, people, and communities can thrive. You can learn more about CBRE Investment Management by scanning the QR code here. Just pick up your phone, open the camera app, and scan. Next up, I'll quickly tell you about OneClick LCA, the world's leading end-to-end sustainability software platform for construction and related manufacturing, with easy-to-use, automated lifecycle assessment and environmental product declaration solutions, among others. It's used in over 170 countries, supporting more than 80 global standards, integrated with more than 20 BIM and other softwares, with the largest global LCA database of more than 250,000 LCA datasets. OneClick LCA is here to help you decarbonize and make your projects and products more sustainable. Finally, I'd like to talk about the OneClick LCA Academy. It is a free training program, which is part of OneClick LCA's commitment to train 1 million low-carbon experts by 2030. Here, you can access hundreds of hours of on-demand course material or attend a live week-long boot camp for comprehensive training on environmental product declarations or life cycle assessment concepts with in-house experts. You can enroll for the next EPD bootcamp by clicking the QR code you see here, or visit academy.oneclicklca.com. And finally, thank you so much for being with us here at the Summer Sustainability Summit. We're always happy to connect with you. You can visit us at oneclicklca.com. You can contact us at sales@oneclicklca.com. Also, check out our LinkedIn and our YouTube channel full of educational material for you to access. And that's all for now. As a note, we have a great session coming up shortly featuring the World Green Building Council's CEO, Christina Gamboa, and Autodesk's Platform Sustainability Strategy Lead, Ron Laughlin. So stay tuned. In about a couple of minutes here, we have more to come. Thank you for the time. And Robbie, thank you. Panu, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.